Hello, and welcome to All Things Chemical, a podcast produced by Bergeson and Campbell, a Washington, D.C. law firm focusing on chemical law, business, and litigation matters. I am Lynn Bergeson. This week, I had the real pleasure of speaking with Dr. Ahna Brutlag, Vice President of Veterinary Services and Senior Veterinary Toxicologist at SafetyCall International and partner of Pet Poison Helpline. Impressively, Dr. Brutlag is a diplomat of the American Board of Veterinary Toxicology and a diplomat of the human counterpart, the American Board of Toxicology, a distinction shared by fewer than 80 people in North America. Dr. Brutlag is at the forefront of adverse effects monitoring and post-market surveillance and has navigated this really complex regulatory landscape for over 2 decades. We discuss today the fascinating intersection of chemicals and pet and animal safety. Now, here is my conversation with Dr. Ahna Brutlag. Ahna, welcome to the podcast. I am so excited that you accepted my invitation, and I'm thrilled you're here.
Well, thank you. I'm very honored to be here, Lynn.
No, it is we who are honored. Why don't you let our listeners know a little bit about yourself and what motivated you to become one of the nation's top veterinary toxicologists?
Happy to. So, my background is I grew up on a farm in Minnesota. And we have always been around animals and loved animals, as many children do. But I was very fortunate to have a good family friend who was a veterinarian. And so even as young as 8 years old, he would allow me to ride with him on house calls. He was an equine vet and very well respected, did a fantastic job, and willing to take this kid who is interested in vet med out to farms. And so, from a young age, I had exposure to the profession and found that it was something that I really did enjoy. I really loved. So to fast forward, I ended up in veterinary school at the University of Minnesota here in St. Paul, Minnesota. And while I was in vet school, I applied for a summer job at a poison control center. And it is actually SafetyCall and Pet Poison Helpline. It is the same poison control center I am at now. But this little summer job in vet school was what led me to toxicology. It exposed me to the specialty, opened my eyes to the fact that, A, this exists, and B, this is a career track that veterinarians can pursue. Although I was in general practice, companion animal practice in the Minneapolis metro area for a few years after graduation, I always stayed on at least part-time at our poison control center. And then there was a full-time position that opened up. I said, you know what, I'm going to give it a try. And if I still like it, I'll give it a year. If I still am interested in toxicology, then I'll pursue board certification. And the rest is history.
Well, in that regard, you have a truly remarkable background in that you are a diplomat of the American Board of Veterinary Toxicology and a diplomat of the American Board of Toxicology, which is, as I mentioned earlier, the human counterpart. Maybe you can address that unique intersection between animals and humans. We see it here at the firm from a lot of regulatory and scientific perspectives in the context of law and litigation and regulatory frameworks. But in that regard, what overlaps, what doesn't, and how your work with or understanding of humans helps or doesn't help, as the case may be, in your work with animals?
Great question. So there's a couple of things to break down here. One, with respect to toxicology, much of the toxicology data that's currently relied upon for, let's say, safety with respect to certain chemicals that we may be exposed to on a daily basis or pharmaceuticals, often the foundation for the toxicology experiments that those companies and we as consumers rely upon starts with animal models. And while we're shifting away on some level from animal models, there is still a very large amount of animal-generated data that we then take and apply to human toxicology. So at the base of a lot of industrial toxicology is our animal models. And so having a very good understanding of what those animal models can and can't tell us, where are the similarities between species, what can we reliably take from rodent data and extrapolate to human data is kind of one of the foundational pieces of toxicology in the veterinary, well, in general.
Sure.
And so having the background to understand the veterinary side of that and then how that can relate up to human safety data, I think has made, myself but also members of our poison control center, our firm here, uh, very, uh, very useful in the world of, I guess.
I would say essential.
Thank you. Thank you. But so while we understand that there can be a foundation from animal, there are also numbers of species specific considerations which need to be given, which really mean we can't always extrapolate. And so knowing when you can and when you can't extrapolate is critical. And then when we come to things like companion animal toxicology, so pets, let's talk about our cats, our dogs, our birds that share our homes with us, horses. Now, there we may find a lot of, again, looking back in the literature, we may find toxicology with respect to dogs, for example. They have been used as a lab animal model, but that's falling out of favor for good reason. There are better in vitro in silico models that we can use. So, one of the biggest challenges I face as a veterinary toxicologist, too, is understanding how to approach let's say, a poisoning situation in which we have extraordinarily limited data from animals. So there may be very limited data on a brand new drug that's just been released on the market for human medicine, but we really don't know what that's going to do in dogs. We certainly don't know what it's going to do in cats or horses because there's no data that has been tested there. But to back up again and just kind of look high level, having the understanding from both kind of the human and the veterinary side really makes it much more much more easy for us to start to make those educated extrapolations and understand where those gaps in data are and what they actually mean from kind of both a boots on the ground standpoint in poison control, but also how we can help industry and regulators and others that are adjacent to toxicology put the pieces together and understand what's relevant, what should we rely on, what isn't, because both of those things, both what we should rely on and knowing what we shouldn't, are key in kind of advancing our knowledge of product safety and toxicology in the U.S.
Well, in that regard, I know a little bit about SafetyCall International because I've had the pleasure of working with you and your team of wonderful specialists. But maybe for the benefit of our listeners, you could tell all of us a little bit more about SafetyCall International, SCI, and the Pet Poison Helpline, because the services that you provide, you and your organization, are both unique, much needed, and I noted earlier, essential. But how do both organizations help both consumers and businesses? What types of services do you offer?
So, Safety Call International is our parent company. And as Safety Call, we are a very unique group of medical practitioners that are actually triple licensed under the fields of medicine, pharmacy, and veterinary medicine. So, as far as we know, we're the only triple licensed professional firm
Yeah,
in the world.
I think you're pretty unique, right?
Yes. And so, we always joke that we were One Health before One Health was cool, right? One Health. But as a firm, we employ experts in both human and veterinary medicine. And Safety Call is at its core, we are a poison control center. And we provide poison control or medical information services, or really adverse event management services to industry. So industry can take advantage of our expertise. That means that, and what I mean by that is we are available 24/7. We partner and contract our poison control services to companies so they can work with us to have immediate access to the most qualified professionals when it comes to toxicology. So a very common example would be, let's say, Lynn, you make a glass cleaner. On
Mhm.
the back of your glass cleaner, you have a number that says, if questions or concerns, call this 1-800 number. And if someone sprayed themselves in the face accidentally with glass cleaner, or maybe they had sprayed it on a window and their cat licked it, and they call
Right.
that number on the back of the bottle. If it's a company that we work with, if someone's calling with a medical concern like that, they will immediately transfer it to our group, and then we will be able to directly help that consumer. We'll be able
Hmm.
to help them with the human exposure, we'll be able to help them with the pet exposure, and then we'll take that, and if it's a regulated product that also requires mandatory adverse event reporting to agencies, to regulatory authorities, then we will also help our customers, our clients on the industry side maintain their regulatory reporting compliance. And so it gives companies an opportunity to, again, have 24/7 support with pharmacists, physicians, and veterinarians, whereas it would be logistically very difficult for them to provide that type of service on their own. So,
Absolutely.
so that's what SafetyCall does. Again,
Hmm.
we partner with industry for adverse event management and medical management of unintentional exposures or intentional exposures in the case where maybe side effects with pharmaceuticals. Now, Pet Poison Helpline is a division of SafetyCall, but Pet Poison Helpline is a direct to the public animal poison control center. And by that, I mean, we're very similar. Many people are familiar with poison control in the form of human poison control. And in the human public poison control centers, there's roughly one per state in the US. And they are there. They're also staffed with experts in toxicology, but only on the human side. They're able to help you with the public with exposures that maybe you ate a mushroom and now you're not sure what it was, or something happened. Your child ate something off the floor and you're not sure what it was, or you know what it was and you need to get immediate assistance. That's what public poison control centers are there for, and they're funded by tax dollars, dollars from insurance companies, healthcare institutions, etc. But the equivalent doesn't exist for animals. So we started Pet Poison Helpline over 20 years ago, and we are staffed with veterinarians and other veterinary professionals that have expertise in toxicology. And we are there for you if your animal, if let's say your dog eats chocolate and you're not sure if it ate enough to cause a problem. What will happen is most people will call their veterinarian, and their vet will say, you know what, I'm not exactly sure what the best method is here. Let's call Pet Poison Helpline. They're the experts. They're going to be able to tell you if your animal needs to be seen by a veterinarian, if there's anything that can be done at home, and if we do recommend that animal be seen by a veterinarian, we help those vets with recommendations for what they need to do for testing, for diagnostic testing. We talk about what the prognosis is. We help guide them with respect to treatment, and we'll support them as long as it takes to get through that case.
Excellent. I didn't appreciate it, Anna, that you've been doing this and your organization's been doing this for over 2 decades. Have there been demonstrable shifts or patterns with regard to pet poisoning in particular that you've discerned over the years? Or is that probably not terribly scientific in that people might become aware of your services and hence report more and hence distort any pattern setting? But any trends that you've seen?
Yes. I think there are some significant trends that we have seen. And so there are multiple noticeable trends that we have picked up on in pet poison control centers.
Mhm.
And these tend to follow two things. One, it tends to follow current events, or I should say, maybe current products that are showing up in people's homes. So if something is in your home, your pets are more likely to be exposed to it. So we definitely see, so let's take, for example, cannabis. Over the past 10 years, there's been dramatic shifts at the state level in the regulation of cannabis. So cannabis is simply just more accessible than it might otherwise have been. More people have different types of cannabis products at home. That means, naturally, more pets are going to get into those types of products just simply because they're there.
Yep. Yep.
So we see that as a definite trend. What people have at home is going to be accidentally consumed by pets. And the other thing that we do see, as you mentioned, Lynn, it's awareness. So let's take, for example, a great example there would be grapes. 15 years ago, many dog owners didn't realize that grapes were toxic to dogs. So I don't think over time more people have grapes in their home necessarily,
Right.
but now we get proportionally many more calls about dogs eating grapes simply because more dog owners are aware that grapes are poisonous. And so when that exposure does happen, they realize it could be a problem. They know to call. When pet owners do see that their dog got into grapes, they now know to call as soon as possible. And because with poison control, time is of the essence, we can
Absolutely.
work to create a better outcome for that pet.
Is it some of the patterns that you see almost seasonal? I had, unfortunately, to go to a vet emergency room recently, and one of the customers there had 1 cat, and I heard her say her other cat was at home, and the speculation was that they put some flea and tick medication on 1 cat and on both cats, actually, and they ended up grooming each other, and both of them became ill. So to the extent that flea and ticks and the summer season is upon us, I would imagine there might be an uptick, not to be punny, of complaints or calls to the pet line about ingestion of that type of medicine that is intended not to be taken orally, but absorbed through the skin of an animal, both whether it's a cat or a dog or any other animal that's being treated, correct?
Yes, we see incredible seasonal shifts in
Mhm.
poison control. So we kind of joke that the holidays that we observe at poison control are all things that, for example, with Valentine's Day, we know we're going to see
Chocolate,
lots of chocolate. Yes, lots of flour, lots of plant ingestions. With Mother's Day, that's another big holiday at poison control because we're
which
seeing
is coming up,
all, which
right?
is coming up. It's right around the corner. And we're going to see all sorts of pets ingesting flowers, bouquets of flowers, and these are typically cats. Around the winter holidays, we know that people are going to have holiday parties. There's going to be more food out. So we get a lot more calls about pets ingesting, oh, what happened? I had a party and my dog was table surfing and it ate grapes and it ate macadamia nuts or it ate, the big plate of chicken wings. What do I do now? So yes, it's very seasonal. In the summer, we see a lot more plant ingestions and outdoor toxins versus in wintertime. Again, it tends to lean a little bit more towards toxins that we might see associated with the seasonal holidays.
What types of industries have you served? And can you give a representative sampling of the types of projects that an industry entity or association might retain Safety Call International to assist with?
So, as Safety Call, we serve primarily 12 different industries. Animal health is definitely a large part of that. On the human side, we also work with pharma, so this could be prescription, OTC, med devices, dietary supplements, and then also industries such as cosmetics or industrial or institutional chemicals, and of course, pesticides is another large industry that we work with. And the the bread and butter of the services that we provide to industry are providing them with a 24/7 availability to credentialed medical experts um, who can help industry again with their adverse event management and regulatory compliance. But the benefit is that they have immediate the benefit is they have immediate access to experts in the clinical toxicology and product safety field. So they can rest assured that their consumers will have access to qualified and professional advice. They also rely on us to help with their signal detection, their signal management. So, industry receives a lot of data in the form of adverse event management intake. But the key is really knowing what to do with that data, and more importantly, how to interpret that data. So that's where we come in to help those industries as well. We look at their data to help them understand, let's say they've received, perhaps you've released a new pharmaceutical to the market, and you're starting to see reports of hair loss. Now, I'm making this as a hypothetical situation, but how do you know if that hair loss is caused by the drug in question? Or is that simply background noise? So the question becomes, how do you identify a signal and then validate that signal?
Hmm.
Because if it is a valid signal, let's say that drug is causing hair loss, and this could be in pets, this could be in people, is there something that we can do about it? So, industry, it would be to their benefit to identify these adverse effects and then figure out how to mitigate those. Perhaps there's a change in formulation that can be that can be performed to minimize those side effects. Perhaps there's a different way to provide information on the bottle, on the label to the consumer. So we can either narrow the patient population or we can provide different types of directions. Maybe it's a topical medication, and maybe instead of applying that medication with a bare hand, it should be applied with a gloved hand to minimize certain types of side effects. So that's one area where we are really invaluable to our clients, is to really help them understand what their adverse event data means.
Do you ever find occasion to share those adverse effect data with EPA or the Food and Drug Administration? I can envision a set of circumstances where you might collect data from disparate sources, but see patterns emerge with respect to a particular chemical. So, entities that are subject to certain laws in the United States have to report information to either EPA in the industrial chemical side under TSCA or on the pesticide side under the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. Those are required by the registrant or the manufacturer of those chemicals. But you see it from a different perspective, and you see information coming in from a wide variety of sources. Do you share those data, or does the government ever seek them out with the hope of discerning patterns and adverse effects from targeted chemical substances that otherwise those patterns wouldn't emerge because they don't have the data to make those connections?
Yes, excellent question. So I'll give you a couple of examples there, Lynn. So we are with companies that contract with us. So, for example, it's a company that we are actively managing their
Mhm.
adverse event data. Yes, we are looking at that data, and we are also doing that. We are also reporting that data often on their behalf to the regulatory authority that those products would sit under. So, for example, we are assisting clients or helping them with their FIFR reports so that they can know that the data that they're collecting is analyzed using qualified professionals and then is reported to and on a timely basis back to EPA, for example. So while we do help companies one-on-one, because we work with so many companies across the industry, we also have the ability to see emerging signals and trends that may be
Mhm.
occurring with other products that are currently marketed. And while it's imperative that we maintain strict confidentiality with respect to our clients' products, this wide breadth of experience and visibility we have to the industry also really allows us to immediately kind of capitalize on or identify trends that are occurring. And we can share that to a certain degree with our clients so they can
Mhm.
become aware that, oh, perhaps there are emerging issues with, you know, certain types of pesticides, or perhaps there are issues with a combination of pesticides that it benefits the industry as a whole to be aware of. We always kind of sort of tongue in cheek talk about the fact that, look, companies can compete on performance, but cooperate on safety.
Totally.
And
Totally.
that's key. Just because we might see a problem with one particular company doesn't mean that there aren't others that are going to benefit from having knowledge of what's going on in, again, a very professional manner. I would say, though, for example, when we talk about our pet poison helpline data. So pet poison helpline data, this is data that technically that we own as a company, and that this has been used. And we have had requests from governmental authorities to say, hey, what are you seeing? And this goes back to cannabis, could be another great
Right.
example. When we started to see a sharp increase in the calls of cannabis type products on Pet Poison Helpline, we worked with FDA CVM to educate them about what we were seeing. And this is specifically looking at CBD products. We did a study looking retrospectively at many hundreds of CBD cases that we had received in a variety of formulations. So this could be things like liquid CBD, CBD in pet treats, CBD in tinctures meant for people, CBD in foods, in certain human foods, to see then what kind of clinical signs did we see in pets and at what dosages. And what became very apparent is there were certain categories of product, like CBD liquids meant for vaping, where we saw really significant signs of poisoning in pets, whereas we did not see those type of signs in things like maybe CBD tinctures meant for people to
Mhm.
take.
Wow.
With further analysis of those products, it became, it's quite apparent that a lot of the CBD products meant for vaping contained many other types of products, including THC, maybe other stimulants, products that were clearly not labeled, and are considered adulterants, where they put there unintentionally, probably a mix of both. But it was very helpful to start to break down what types of formulations actually pose greater risk, especially with CBD in a somewhat unregulated environment.
Exactly. Well, in addition to cannabis and CBD, are you seeing other categories of emerging toxins on your radar screen? And how do environmental toxins and climate change, to the extent they are factors, relevant to what you're seeing clinically? I would imagine there could be a new kind of array of products out there that might be addressing drought, for example, in the agrochemical space, or just chemicals writ large that haven't been used historically, but you're seeing an uptick. It does climate change have a place in that analysis, or is that not relevant?
With respect to climate change, yes, it is relevant. So what we're seeing as far as from a toxicology standpoint is as the country becomes warmer and weather patterns become more tumultuous,
Mhm.
we're seeing certain types of environmental toxicants, such as blue-green algae, or more appropriately called cyanobacteria. So cyanobacteria, these are algal. Technically, this is a bacteria. It's referred to as an algae by lay terms. But these cyanobacteria overgrow in bodies of water, especially in periods of drought. The water becomes very nutrient rich. It becomes more concentrated, especially if you have any kind of agricultural or maybe manure runoff, things of that nature. We'll see dramatic overgrowths of this type of bacteria, which actually is a One Health problem. These cyanobacteria you know, im- can cause significant harm to both humans and to pets. We can see liver failure. We can see sudden acute neurologic death. We can see significant skin issues, or rashes and things of that nature with cyanobacteria. So the geographic distribution and the frequency of certain types of toxicants are more predominant with climate change. We're also seeing an increase in geographic distribution of, well, let's go back and talk about fleas and ticks. So right now, there's a there are many incidents of tick-borne diseases such as Lyme disease, or ehrlichiosis, anaplasmosis, that can affect both people and pets.
Mhm.
And yeah, Canada is a great example. We're seeing now, due to climate change, an increase in tick-borne disease in Canada. So it's this kind of march northward of ticks that 10 years ago, the incidence would have been much, much lower. And so this is, again, it's important for both pets and for people. Protect your pets from common parasite-borne vectors, like tick-borne disease. But also in the southern part of the U.S., due to climate change, right, we're starting to see more uh, increased frequency with even diseases like malaria, diseases
My
that we
goodness.
used to think were only acquired when people traveled outside of
Right.
the US. Now it's sporadic, but concerning because we're achieving greater environments where mosquitoes that carry that or vectors for malaria can thrive in certain parts of the US. So yes, climate change will drive and continue to what we see from a toxicological perspective, but also certainly just from a disease and a vector-borne perspective as well.
Reminds me of a number of years ago, one of our horses acquired Lyme's disease. You know, our horses are outside a lot, and we spray them and try to keep all the pesky flies, horse flies, mosquitoes, ticks. But for one reason or another, we noticed one of our horses was just listless and just not very energetic, and I was really surprised to learn that, horses can get Lyme's disease. I would imagine that might be on the uptick as well these days, because I read recently in the, New York Times that flea and tick season are ferocious this year and probably going to be more aggressive than in any year past for reasons I don't understand, but it probably has something to do with climate change.
Absolutely. I think climate change, weather patterns. So there are
Yep.
certain times of year. So there's an organization called the Companion Animal Parasite Council. They release a parasite forecast annually to help veterinarians understand what the predicted incidence of vector-borne disease is going to be throughout the US in the coming year and where. So it's a very helpful tool for veterinarians because you can look at their maps, which are very informative, and see, okay, depending on the area where you are, is there going to be a greater likelihood of tick-borne disease? For example, I live in Minnesota, so I can feel your pain with Lyme disease. We're sort of a Lyme central here outside of Lyme, Connecticut. And,
Yes.
it's not uncommon. My dogs have been exposed to tick-borne disease, even though I do keep them on on preventatives. I
Right.
tested positive for Lyme disease and
Did
was
you really?
put on a course of antibiotics. I never
Uh,
had problems, but I had the target lesion
right.
from the tick, and so that was exactly. And again, going back to Canada right now, Canadian veterinarians are going to have to be a lot more concerned about Lyme disease in their patients than they ever have been before. So, yes, I think partly it is just certainly weather patterns, but certainly climate change does not help us at all when it comes to a lot of these problems.
In addition to your leadership roles at Safety Call and on the pet helpline, you are also on the editorial board of the Merck Veterinary Manual, which I know the vet techs that I know refer to it as the Bible. You are also an adjunct professor at the Department of Veterinary and Biomedical Science College of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Minnesota. I don't know where you find the time to do all these things, but in addition to your multiple day jobs, leadership positions, and everything that you do, your teaching and writing are important aspects of just informing others of all of the learnings that you have acquired in your various professional capacities. But what does teaching and informing mean to you with regard to the next generation of veterinarians?
To me, it's really important that students leave our College of Veterinary Medicine here at the University of Minnesota feeling confident that they can treat and understand the most common intoxications that they're going to encounter. So let's say, for example, we know that the most common things we're called about at Pet Poison Helpline as far as toxins for dogs go is chocolate, number one, grapes and raisins, um, rodenticides, mouse and rat poisons,
Right,
uh, things like xylitol. So I want them to be able to leave and feel confident that they can treat patients when exposed to, because that's inevitable. They're going to see patients that are exposed to these things,
right.
that they have the skills and the confidence to treat those types of patients. And also to leave with a strong foundation in just the understanding of basic toxicological principles. Even well-educated and well-informed professionals can still make some really routine misconceptions about toxicology. So let's take, for example, dose. And we have a saying in toxicology that the dose makes the poison.
Right.
And, well, inherently, we understand this. It's so quickly forgotten, sometimes in cases of emergency, or especially in cases where the data isn't crystal clear and it's hard to understand. So let's say, for example, you know, um, uh, we've just dealt on going back to kind of fleas and ticks on a national scale with a product involving a flea and tick pet collar. And Lynn, as you had mentioned, these collars, adverse events that occur with pesticides need to be reported to EPA. And therefore, those adverse events are public data. And so a couple of years ago, a USA Today article came out and it was focused on the Seresto pet collar and said, look at all of these adverse events that have happened with respect to the Seresto pet collar, including 1,700 deaths in animals. And that is an alarming statistic. There's no doubt about that. But when you dive into what that data really means, there's a very, very different story that emerges. So we actually were part of that, and we looked at the 1,700 fatalities to try and understand how likely is it that the collar actually caused these. And when you look at the fatalities as a whole, you can see there's deaths from all sorts of different causes and a number of deaths just because these animals are geriatric and they're old.
They're old.
Right.
They tend
for
to
better
die.
or for worse, we all die at some point. And so
Yes.
having the ability to really help veterinarians understand that this may not have been deaths caused by the collar. These are deaths that happen because the animal had to be wearing the collar, had used the collar, and ultimately died of a whole variety of diseases. And when we look at what the dose of pesticide that collar releases over time, it becomes very clear very quickly that the dose would not be sufficient to cause harm to these animals. So, it's having veterinarians, the thing that we're very passionate about with respect to teaching is just being able to educate vets and likewise the general public too about what's safe, what isn't, and how to begin to understand those differences.
That's a great message. What is the most unusual or memorable case that you've worked on?
One that really sticks with me, Lynn, is a case that we had involving a family that had a foster child who was high school age, and they had two dogs that came down very quickly with this rapid onset of neurological signs. These dogs were tremoring, and they had a really wide base stance, and something was clearly very wrong. They immediately brought them into the family vet, and the vet was really concerned that the dogs had been given some type of illicit substance, maybe a hallucinogen or maybe some type of drug that, and the concern, of course, then sort of fell to the foster child and the family to say, well, what did they bring into the home? Could their friends have poisoned the dogs unintentionally? And the dogs, before they developed these neurological signs, had also vomited. And I have to say, the pet owners had the foresight. They picked up the vomit, but they brought it with them to the veterinary hospital, which we always love as vets. I know that's disgusting, but it's helpful.
No, but it's super helpful.
It's very helpful.
Foresight.
So we were able to test the vomit from one of those dogs. And the veterinarian, of course, thought we were going to find some sort of illicit substance. What we found was actually a mycotoxin or a toxin created by mold called Penetrim A. This is a common toxin that's created by the penicillium mold, which commonly grows on food. So you find this in compost piles and things of that nature. Well, it turns out about a week prior, the kids in the house had a pizza party. And some of the pizza didn't get finished, and it got accidentally shoved under a bed in the basement and was getting moldy. And dogs, doing what they do best, they sniffed it out.
Found it.
They ate the moldy pizza, and it was actually the moldy pizza that was the cause of the really significant neurological signs. So both the child and the child was absolved of all wrongdoing, of course, and it was a happy ending. The dogs did really well.
Well, I would imagine that you probably have developed your investigative skills. I mean, how do you approach cases where the owner does not know or affirmatively does not wish to admit what a pet might have been exposed to?
Ah, exactly. We become detectives. That's what
Right.
toxicologists do. Let's take owners who don't want to admit, because this is something that we deal with routinely, especially if it may involve an illicit substance.
Right.
So, cannabis is a great example. Before regulations were somewhat loosened, it was fairly common. People didn't really want to admit that their pet might have ingested cannabis. They didn't want someone to know that they had that at home.
Right.
And so they would call and they would tell us these strange stories like, my dog ingested a match, but now it's, standing with this very glazed, it has a really
Stone
glazed
look.
expression. Yeah, clearly what they're describing is we know. And we would say, look, we're not law enforcement. I'm not here. I'm not going to call the cops because your dog accidentally ingested something. But if you can tell me what happened, the quicker I understand, the faster it is that we'll be able to identify what's wrong with your pet and we'll be able to treat your pet. And so having pet owners have that comfort that they know they're not going to get, quote unquote, in trouble
Well, it's no
is
judgment, right? I mean, you're here to help
exactly.
the pet.
Exactly, exactly. And veterinarians are. Of course, there are those rare situations where poisoning boils down to intent. If there was intent to hurt an animal, that's a different story. But
Yeah.
that is incredibly rare. These are oftentimes they're simply accidents. You're right. Removing judgment and helping that pet owner feel that they're in a safe environment goes a long way to enabling us or the veterinarians who are hands-on with that animal to be able to treat them appropriately.
I asked earlier about emerging toxins and then was sidetracked a little bit about climate change, although they may be related. But in the emerging toxins area, are you finding anything kind of unusual or surprising?
Yes. In fact, we have just published, Lynn, on a very fascinating topic. So we are seeing an increase in dogs, again, ingesting the contents of migraine wraps. So these are wraps that can be either cooled or warmed in the microwave, and then you put them around your face. But the contents of them, what we're seeing is dogs would chew into these masks and within hours become extraordinarily sick with really significant
Dear.
neurological symptoms. And we've had several fatalities. So, in testing those, so normally I wouldn't expect significant signs in a case where those types of gels in masks like that are ingested. So we have had migraine wraps tested and have found very large concentrations of acrylamide in those wraps. Now, acrylamide should not be there in such large concentrations. So that and acrylamide is a very potent neurotoxin. Now,
Right.
why the acrylamide is there, we don't know yet. Is this a byproduct that has somehow over concentrated? Is this an adulteration? Is it or is acrylamide there because the processing used to potentially remove it or reduce the formulation is too expensive? There's a lot of unanswered questions right now, but something that we have been extremely concerned about over the past year and have recently put out some publications, some warnings, and had abstracts at various scientific conferences to help educate the toxicological community and poison control and pet owners that this could be a real problem if your dog ingests this.
I haven't even mentioned the word acrylamide in so long. I worked many years ago when acrylamide and N-methylyl acrylamide were used in sewer grouting operations to block tree growth from breaking through sewer lines. So it's just very interesting to know that it might be either a degradant or a metabolite or some impurity in these masks that you're referring to. What a kind of shocking development. But I'm glad you found it.
Absolutely. Us too, yes. It's imperative. It's one thing to have these cases where you just have no explanation for what's going on, but it was very helpful for us. We actually partnered with the Veterinary Toxicology Lab at UC Davis, and they
Hmm.
were the ones to do the testing and develop new methodologies to test these specific gels and helped us identify and quantify the amount of
Right,
acrylamide in the
right.
gels.
Oh, getting back to that dose makes the poison part, right? You have to have a
Absolutely.
sufficient dose in order to be, to have an effect. I've noticed in preparing for this podcast that you've given a wide variety of media interviews that range from Reader's Digest to Martha Stewart Living, National Public Radio, The Wall Street Journal. That leads me to conclude that you feel passionate and obligated to continue to inform the general public about pet health writ large. Maybe you can, in addition to the point you just made about just focusing on the dose makes the poison, what are the top 3 things that you wish just regular old pet owners like me, we've got all kinds of critters in our household, know about our animals' well-being when it comes to toxicology?
Number one, I think the bottom line, the most important thing is timing. So if you know that your pet got into something it shouldn't, time is of the essence.
Yeah.
The sooner that you can reach out to an expert who can help you with that, the sooner we can potentially decontaminate that animal. Maybe we can induce vomiting and reduce the load of poison, the dose of
Mhm.
poison that that pet ingested. And the sooner we can begin treatment. And all of that is going to lead to a better prognosis and a less expensive veterinary bill at the end of the day. So timing with regard to poisoning and toxicology is critical. The other thing I would say is species differences are key. So it's good to remember that pets are not just small people, and likewise, cats are not just small dogs. There are very meaningful species differences. We've already talked about this, of course, but dogs are more likely to be poisoned by things like chocolate or grapes and raisins, versus cats may have a pretty impressive resistance against certain types of anticoagulant rodenticides, but are extremely sensitive to lilies. Whereas dogs, they don't get poisoned by lilies. So understanding species differences is quite key. And the other thing too, I think more and more, and this is becoming more important in the past probably year or so, is that natural doesn't equal safe.
Right.
Just because something is natural does not automatically mean it's safer. There's lots of
Or
natural things.
non-toxic, right.
Or non-toxic, exactly. So snake venom, perfectly natural. Arsenic, perfectly natural. All of these things are natural, but can be, in fact, quite harmful. So I think that's something that it's easy for us to forget that, but is quite meaningful. Just using something just solely because it's natural does not mean you're using a product that might be safer compared to a synthetic alternative.
I didn't want to end our conversation without reviewing the Pet Poison Helpline emergency instructions. I think our listeners might find them very helpful, and providing the phone numbers for people listening in on this, because I know there's some very interesting information that you provide. So, what do you do if your pet is poisoned?
The first thing, again, we talked about time is of the essence. So we want to act as quickly as possible. I would, if there's a situation in which you need to remove your pet from an environment, let's say you spilled a bottle of pills on the floor, get
Right.
your pet out of that room as fast as possible to prevent them from ingesting more pills. Also, make sure that your pet is, if your pet is acting normally at the time, we have some time to work with. You can call your veterinarian and seek advice. You can call Pet Poison Helpline and seek advice. If your pet is actively sick, having seizures, having, intense episodes of vomiting, it's best to get to the veterinary clinic first and then call poison control second. But
Okay.
also, I want to remind pet owners not to give anything at home unless you're instructed to do so. For example, don't try and induce vomiting in your dog or your cat unless you are instructed to do so by a veterinary, by Pet Poison Helpline, because we may accidentally make things worse. Sometimes pets eat something that might be corrosive. Let's say they ingested toilet bowl cleaner that can cause tissue damage. If we don't want to induce vomiting in a situation like that, because we can actually cause re-exposure to the esophagus and even more tissue damage. So don't do anything while trying to help without seeing. The next step would be to call Pet Poison Helpline. The Pet Poison Helpline is available 24/7 at 855-764-7661.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you, Anna, for everything that you do to protect our pet friends, being a huge animal lover. I just find what you do, the advances that you are making, the information that you share, and the counsel that you give invaluable. And I wanted all of our listeners to be aware of your organizations, SafetyCall International, and the Pet Poison Helpline, because it is an invaluable resource and you're just doing great work. And I want to thank you for being with us here today.
Oh, I'm so happy to. Thank you so much, Lynn. I appreciate your interest in the topic and helping pet owners keep their pets safer at home.
My thanks again to Dr. Brutlag for sharing her insights on adverse effects reporting, pet safety, and all the extraordinary work that SafetyCall International and the Pet Poison Helpline provides companies and pet owners alike to protect our animal friends. All Things Chemical is produced by Jackson Bierfeld of Bierfeld Audio, LLC. We will be back again soon to further inform and entertain you about all things chemical. Bye-bye.